The Yuba County Five, America's Dyatlov Pass. For those who believe in logical explanations, missing persons cases are eventually solved through evidence, witness testimony, and investigative persistence. For over 4 decades, law enforcement officials, search and rescue specialists, and forensic experts have asked, how do 5 men vanish after a basketball game, only to be found months later in circumstances that defy every rational explanation? This is the story of the Yuba County Five. Long before the Yuba County case captured national attention, American law enforcement had documented numerous incidents where groups of people disappeared under mysterious circumstances, only to be found dead in ways that suggested something beyond simple misadventure or foul play. The 1959 Dyatlov Pass incident in Russia's Ural Mountains saw 9 experienced hikers found dead, their tent cut open from the inside, bodies scattered across the snow with bizarre injuries and traces of radiation. In 1969, 5 hunters disappeared in California's Sierra Nevada mountains, their remains discovered months later in a pattern that suggested panic and disorientation despite being experienced outdoorsmen. What made these cases particularly disturbing wasn't just the deaths themselves, but the inexplicable behavior preceding them. Experienced people making decisions that seemed to guarantee their demise, abandoning shelter and warmth, removing protective clothing in freezing conditions, walking away from clear paths to safety toward certain death. By the late 1972s, search and rescue teams in Northern California were familiar with the Sierra Nevadas' dangers. Sudden weather changes, disorienting terrain, the ease with which even experienced hikers could become lost. But they'd developed protocols and patterns. Most lost persons were found within 72 hours. Bodies recovered in the spring thaw showed predictable patterns of hypothermia and exposure. Nothing in their experience prepared them for what they would find in the mountains above Yuba City in the summer of 1978. The case would become known as America's Dyatlov Pass, a comparison that understated rather than exaggerated its strangeness. The story begins not with a mystery, but with hope and determination. 5 men in their late 20s and early 30s, all living with mild intellectual disabilities, had formed a basketball team and were training for the Special Olympics. They called themselves the Gateway Gators after the Gateway Project's community center in Yuba City where they practiced. Gary Mathias, 25, was the exception to the group's profile. He had a high IQ and had served in the army, but suffered from schizophrenia. When properly medicated, he functioned well and served as the group's informal leader and protector. He was the only one with a driver's license among the regular group. Jack Madruga, 30, owned the car they would be driving that night, a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego he'd saved for years to purchase. He was meticulous about the vehicle, kept it in pristine condition, and knew its capabilities intimately. He'd worked at a local catering company and was known for his gentle nature and reliability. William Sterling, 29, worked at a waste management facility and lived independently with minimal support. His mother described him as responsible and predictable, he always called if plans changed, never missed work, and followed routines with comforting consistency. Jack Hewitt, 24, was the youngest of the group. He worked at a local market and lived with his parents. Friends and family described him as sweet-natured, trusting, and deeply loyal to his basketball teammates. Ted Weiher, 32, was the largest of the group, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing approximately 200 pounds. He worked at a snack bar and lived with his mother. He was described as good-natured but stubborn once he set his mind to something. Changing it was nearly impossible. He also had a minor heart condition that required regular monitoring but wasn't considered life-threatening with proper care. These 5 men weren't adventurers or risk-takers. They were creatures of habit who thrived on routine and the support of their families and community. None had any outdoor survival training. None were familiar with the mountain regions outside Yuba City, and on the 24th of February 1978, they had every reason to go straight home after their basketball game. The Gateway Gators had a basketball game scheduled in Chico, California, about 50 miles north of Yuba City. It was a preliminary game, and they were excited, win or lose. They were heading to a basketball tournament in a few days that could lead them to the Special Olympics. They'd been preparing for months, and their families shared their excitement. The plan was simple and well-established. Gary Mathias would drive Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego north on Highway 70 to Chico. They'd watch the game, maybe get something to eat afterward, and drive straight home. The route was direct, Highway 70 south, back to Yuba City. Gary had made the drive before. They'd be home by midnight at the latest. The game ended around 10 p.m. Multiple witnesses confirmed the 5 men were at the game, seated together, appearing happy and engaged. They were seen leaving the gymnasium together, heading toward the parking lot where Madruga's distinctive Mercury Montego was parked. What happened next became a mystery that would haunt investigators for decades. A store owner near the gymnasium remembered seeing them stop at his convenience store around 10:30 p.m. They purchased snacks and soft drinks, normal post-game behavior. They seemed in good spirits, discussing the game they'd watched. Nothing appeared unusual or distressing. That was the last confirmed sighting of all 5 men together while they were alive. At some point after leaving Chico, instead of taking Highway 70 directly south toward home, the Mercury Montego turned east onto Mountain House Road, a route that led into the Sierra Nevada foothills and eventually to the Plumas National Forest. This was emphatically not on their way home. It was, in fact, the opposite direction. Mountain House Road was a winding, poorly maintained route that saw little traffic, especially in late February when snow still covered the higher elevations. The road climbed steadily into increasingly remote terrain, past abandoned mining claims and isolated Forest Service roads. There was no reason, no conceivable reason for them to take this route. Around 11:30 p.m., a woman named Carol Tyler, driving home with her husband on Mountain House Road, encountered the Mercury Montego driving erratically. According to her testimony to police, the car was moving unusually slowly for the conditions, weaving slightly within its lane. As they approached, she noticed several men inside who appeared to be in a state of fear. When she tried to get a better look, the Mercury suddenly accelerated and sped away from them. This encounter troubled investigators for multiple reasons. First, why would the men appear frightened? Of what? The Tylers posed no threat, they were simply other travelers on the same road. Second, why accelerate away unless they were fleeing from something? But fleeing what? The Tylers saw nothing else on the road. The area was empty, isolated, dark. Approximately 20 minutes later, at a location about 8 miles further up Mountain House Road, another witness named Joseph Shawns had his own bizarre encounter. Shawns had suffered a heart attack earlier that evening and had pulled off the road in his pickup truck, waiting for daylight and hoping the episode would pass so he could drive himself to a hospital. According to Shawns' testimony, around midnight, he saw headlights approaching. A car which he later identified as matching the description of Madruga's Mercury pulled to a stop nearby. He could see silhouettes of multiple people inside. He called out, asking for help, explaining he'd had a heart attack and needed assistance. The car didn't respond. The occupants seemed to be arguing or having an animated discussion. Shawns called out again. Still no response. Then, inexplicably, the car drove away, continuing further up the mountain road. But Shawns' testimony included even stranger details. He reported that shortly after the Mercury drove away, he saw a group of people with flashlights moving through the forest near his truck. He heard voices, men talking, though he couldn't make out words. He saw the flashlight beams sweeping through the trees, as if searching for something. Then he saw other lights, distant lights higher on the mountain that he described as red. He couldn't identify what they were. They appeared to be moving, but the darkness and his condition made details impossible to determine. Hours later, as dawn approached, Shawns flagged down a passing truck and was taken to a hospital. He survived, and later testified to police about what he'd witnessed. But by then, the 5 men had vanished into the wilderness. On the 25th of February 1978, when the 5 men failed to return home, their families immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. These weren't men who stayed out all night. They weren't the type to take spontaneous road trips. They had jobs, routines, commitments. Their absence triggered immediate alarm. Families contacted police, who began searching the obvious routes between Chico and Yuba City. For 3 days, they found nothing. Then, on February 28, a Forest Service employee discovered Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego on a remote mountain road near Rogers Cow Camp, approximately 70 miles from Chico in the opposite direction from home. The car's location was stunning. It was 4,400 feet in elevation on a snow-covered road that shouldn't have been accessible to a standard passenger vehicle in late February. Yet there it sat, perfectly intact, undamaged except for minor scrapes on the undercarriage consistent with driving over rough terrain. The investigation of the vehicle revealed details that deepened rather than clarified the mystery. The Mercury was unlocked. The keys were missing, never to be recovered. The fuel tank was nearly full enough gas to drive back down the mountain and home multiple times over. The battery was dead, but investigators determined this was due to the dome light being left on, slowly draining power over several days. Inside the car, investigators found the men's basketball uniforms neatly stored. They found maps, including a map of California with the route from Chico to Yuba City clearly marked the route they should have taken. They found personal items belonging to each man. What they didn't find was any sign of struggle, any evidence of foul play, or any indication of why the car had been abandoned. Most puzzling was the car's condition itself. It hadn't been crashed or forced off the road. It wasn't stuck, the wheels had traction, and the snow around it wasn't deep enough to trap the vehicle. A later test showed the Mercury could be started and driven away with only a replacement battery. There was no mechanical reason the car had been abandoned at that location. The windows were partially rolled down, which seemed odd given the freezing temperatures. Inside the car, investigators found a packet of food purchased from the convenience store near the basketball game, partially consumed. The men had been eating while driving normal behavior. Nothing suggested panic or distress at that point. But the car's location presented a staggering question. How had they gotten so far up a mountain road that should have been impassable to a standard passenger vehicle? And more importantly, why? The discovery of the Mercury Montego triggered a massive search and rescue operation. Volunteers, law enforcement, and search and rescue specialists combed the surrounding wilderness. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the forest. Search dogs tracked scents but lost them in the snow and complex terrain. The area around Rogers Cow Camp was unforgiving wilderness. The elevation meant temperatures at night regularly dropped below freezing. Snow cover was several feet deep in places. The men were wearing the clothes they'd worn to a basketball game, casual jackets, sneakers, pants suitable for a February evening in the valley but entirely inadequate for mountain conditions. None of the men had survival training. None were familiar with wilderness navigation. Gary Mathias had Army training, but nothing specific to winter survival in mountain conditions. The search teams operated on the assumption that if the men had abandoned the car and attempted to walk out, they would have succumbed to exposure within 24 to 48 hours given the conditions and their lack of preparation. But despite extensive searching, no bodies were found. No additional evidence emerged. The wilderness had apparently swallowed 5 men without a trace. The search was called off in late March as spring approached and the likelihood of finding survivors became nil. Families were left with devastating uncertainty. The official investigation remained open, but investigators had no leads, no evidence of foul play, no logical explanation for any of the events. Then the snow began to melt. On the 4th of June, 1978, a motorcyclist riding through the forest discovered something that would transform the Yuba County Five case from a missing persons mystery into something far stranger and more disturbing. A Forest Service trailer at a location known as the Mountain House Tract, approximately 19.4 miles from where the Mercury Montego had been abandoned, had been broken into. The trailer was a simple shelter used by Forest Service employees during fire season, essentially a small camping trailer with minimal supplies stored for emergencies. Inside the trailer, the motorcyclist found the body of Ted Waher. The condition of the body and the scene inside the trailer created a mystery that defied every expectation and logical explanation. Ted Weiher had been dead for approximately 8 to 13 weeks, meaning he'd survived in that trailer for weeks or possibly months after February 24. The coroner determined he'd died from a combination of exposure, starvation, and pneumonia, but the circumstances of his death made no sense whatsoever. The trailer had supplies. There was a large cache of food, sea rations, canned goods, and freeze-dried meals that would have sustained one person for months or 5 people for weeks. The food had been opened and consumed, but only partially. A significant amount remained. There was a propane tank connected to a small heater. The tank was full. The heater had never been turned on. Ted Weiher, who had survived in that trailer long enough to lose between 80 to 100 pounds from his starting weight of 200 pounds, had starved and frozen to death with heat and food available. He was wrapped in 8 sheets taken from the trailer's storage. His feet were frostbitten and gangrenous, and he'd been lying on the trailer's bed. Outside the trailer, investigators found a locker that had been pried open. Inside were additional rations, a first aid kit, and other supplies resources that could have kept the men alive but that appeared to have been barely utilized. The questions multiplied impossibly. Why hadn't Ted used the heater? Why hadn't he eaten more of the available food? The sea rations required no preparation, they could be eaten directly from the can. Yet he'd apparently rationed them severely while starving to death. Why hadn't he attempted to walk out? The trailer was only about 19 miles from the car, a grueling distance, but not impossible, and certainly preferable to slowly dying. In the weeks he'd survived there, the weather had improved significantly. Spring had arrived, snow had melted, and temperatures had moderated. By April, walking out would have been difficult but feasible. Most disturbing was the evidence that Ted hadn't been alone initially. The trailer showed signs of multiple occupants. The food consumption pattern suggested more than one person. Where were the others? As the snow continued melting through June and July, search teams returned to the area and made additional horrifying discoveries. On June 4, the same day Ted Weiher's body was found, search teams located a skeleton approximately 12 miles from the Mercury Montego. The remains were identified through dental records as Jack Madruga. His body was found in a densely wooded area, far from any trail or road. The coroner determined he'd died shortly after the disappearance, likely within days, from hypothermia and exposure. He'd been wearing only the light clothing he'd worn to the basketball game. 11 miles from the car, in the opposite direction from Madruga, searchers found a partial skeleton identified as William Sterling. Like Madruga, he'd died from exposure, and his remains showed he'd survived only a short time after abandoning the vehicle. On July 15, more remains were discovered approximately 11 miles from the car Jack Hewitt. His body was more decomposed due to its location in a drainage area, but cause of death appeared consistent with the others: hypothermia and exposure within days of February 24. Gary Mathias was never found. Despite extensive searches of the surrounding area, no trace of him emerged. He remains missing to this day. Investigators and forensic experts attempting to reconstruct what happened faced a series of impossibilities that defied logical explanation. The timeline made no sense. Madruga, Sterling, and Hewitt had died within days of the car being abandoned, expected outcomes given the conditions and their lack of preparation. But Ted Weiher had survived for weeks or months at the trailer, 19 miles from the car. This meant one of two scenarios. Either Ted had traveled 19 miles through snow-covered wilderness with inadequate clothing and footwear, a journey that should have killed him within hours, and somehow survived long enough to reach the trailer. Or he'd remained near the car initially, while the others attempted to walk out and died, then later traveled alone to the trailer. Neither scenario was plausible. The distance was too great, the conditions too harsh, and Ted's physical condition and intellectual disability made such a journey virtually impossible. Yet he'd somehow reached the trailer and survived there. The behavior inside the trailer was equally inexplicable. The propane heater's operation wasn't complex. It had simple controls and required only turning a valve and lighting it. Ted's family confirmed he was capable of operating similar simple devices, yet he'd never turned it on despite temperatures inside the unheated trailer dropping below freezing at night. The food situation was even stranger. C rations are designed for easy consumption pull-tab cans that require no preparation or tools, yet Ted had consumed them sparingly while starving to death. Some investigators suggested he might have been rationing them for the others, waiting for them to arrive. But why? If he was alone at the trailer, rationing made no sense. And if others had been there initially, where did they go? The wrapper evidence told a disturbing story. Inside the trailer, investigators found numerous food wrappers and cans, consumed over a period of weeks. But the pattern of consumption was odd, periods of eating followed by periods where nothing was consumed, then more eating. It suggested erratic behavior or possibly multiple people taking turns eating. Most disturbing was what Ted's autopsy revealed. Despite starving to death, his stomach contents showed he'd eaten a meal shortly before death. He'd consumed some of the C rations in his final hours. This meant he wasn't too weak or incapacitated to access food. He chose not to eat more, even as his body was shutting down from starvation. The frostbite on his feet indicated he'd walked significant distances through snow. The gangrenous condition suggested the injuries had occurred weeks before his death. Yet he'd survived with them, excruciatingly painful injuries that should have incapacitated him but apparently didn't prevent him from moving around the trailer and accessing food. Beyond the timeline and behavior questions, physical evidence at the scene created additional mysteries that investigators couldn't resolve. Footprints in the snow, photographed before the spring melt, showed tracks leading away from the car in multiple directions. Some went toward the locations where bodies were eventually found. But others led nowhere. They simply stopped in the middle of the forest with no apparent destination or explanation for why someone would walk in that direction. Most puzzling were tracks that appeared to circle back on themselves, as if whoever made them had walked in loops before heading in a different direction. This suggested disorientation, but all 4 sets of tracks showed similar circular patterns in different locations. Either all 4 men independently became disoriented in the same way, or something else was happening. The Mercury Montego's location remained unexplained. Multiple test runs by police determined that a standard passenger vehicle shouldn't have been able to navigate the snow-covered road to the point where the car was found. Yet there it was, undamaged and functional. How had they gotten it there? Gary Mathias's absence added another layer of mystery. As the most capable member of the group Army trained, higher functioning intellectually, he should have been the most likely to survive, or at least to be found. Yet he vanished completely. His body was never recovered. No trace of him emerged despite exhaustive searches. Some investigators theorized Gary had survived, potentially left the trailer after Ted's death, and either died in a location not yet discovered or possibly walked out and chose not to return. But this theory raised obvious questions. Why abandon his friends? Why not seek help? And if he had walked out successfully, why never contact his family or authorities? The witness testimonies from the night of February 24 remain troubling. Carol Tyler's report of the men appearing in a state of fear suggested they were running from something. But from what? The Tylers saw nothing threatening. The area was empty. Joseph Shans's account of seeing people with flashlights in the forest and his description of strange red lights on the mountain was difficult to reconcile with the physical evidence. Flashlights were never found with any of the bodies or at the trailer. The red lights were never identified or explained. Over the decades since the discovery, numerous theories have attempted to explain what happened to the Yuba County Five. None adequately account for all the evidence. Theory 1. They were chased or threatened. This theory suggests the men encountered someone threatening possibly Carol Tyler and her husband, though they denied any aggressive behavior and fled in panic. Disoriented and frightened, they drove up the mountain and eventually abandoned the car when conditions became impassable. Problems. This doesn't explain why they continued so far up the mountain when multiple turnoffs existed. It doesn't account for Joseph Shans's testimony about them ignoring his calls for help if they were fleeing a threat. Why not ask a stranger for assistance? Most critically, It doesn't explain Ted Weir's survival and bizarre behavior at the trailer. Theory 2. Drug-related incident. Gary Mathias had connections to drug users, and some theorize the group encountered a drug deal or illegal activity in the mountains. They witnessed something dangerous and were either chased or threatened into fleeing. Problems. No evidence of drugs was found in the Mercury Montego. The men's families adamantly denied any involvement with drugs beyond Gary's personal struggles. The location where the car was found wasn't near any known drug activity locations. And again, this doesn't explain the trailer situation. Theory 3. Gary Mathias experienced a psychotic episode. Gary suffered from schizophrenia and required medication. If he'd skipped doses or experienced a break, he might have become paranoid and convinced the others they needed to flee. As the driver and authority figure, they might have followed his lead even into dangerous situations. Problems. Gary's family confirmed he'd been taking his medication and was stable. Multiple witnesses at the basketball game noted nothing unusual about his behavior. His army training should have included some survival skills that could have helped the group, and his complete disappearance remains unexplained. Theory 4. They got lost and made catastrophic decisions. The simplest explanation suggests they made a wrong turn, realized their mistake too late, and a series of bad decisions compounded into tragedy. Disoriented by darkness and unfamiliar terrain, they abandoned the car unnecessarily and scattered in panic. Problems. This doesn't account for how they got so far up a road that should have been impassable. It doesn't explain witness accounts of them appearing frightened before reaching the remote locations. Most critically, it doesn't explain Ted Weir's survival pattern and refusal to use available heat and food. Theory 5. Foul play followed by cover-up. Some investigators suspected the men encountered foul play, perhaps a violent confrontation with hunters or locals, and their bodies were scattered to make it appear they died from exposure. Ted might have witnessed the attacks and fled to the trailer, where trauma and fear prevented him from behaving rationally. Problems. Autopsies showed no signs of violence on any of the bodies. The scattered locations where bodies were found didn't suggest intentional placement. And foul play doesn't explain the Mercury Montego's location or condition. Jack Beecham, one of the primary investigators on the case, spoke to journalists years later about the frustration of the investigation. Every answer we found just created more questions. He said, nothing fit together. It was like trying to solve 5 different mysteries that happened to involve the same 5 people. Beecham noted that in his decades of law enforcement experience, he'd never encountered a case where the physical evidence so completely contradicted logical explanation. If you look at each piece of evidence in isolation, it makes sense, he explained. Car abandoned in snow? That happens. People dying from exposure? Tragic but understandable. Someone surviving in a trailer? Possible. But when you put it all together, nothing works. The timeline doesn't work. The distances don't work. The behavior doesn't work. What troubled Beecham most was Ted Weir's death. He had everything he needed to survive, Beecham said. Heat, food, shelter. He lived for weeks or months in that trailer, losing half his body weight, suffering from frostbite and pneumonia, and never once turned on the heater that was 3 feet away from where he was lying. I've investigated hundreds of deaths. I've never seen anything like it. Search and rescue specialists who participated in the investigation noted that the distances involved were staggering. 19 miles through snow-covered wilderness is incredibly difficult even for experienced, equipped hikers, one specialist explained. For someone with Ted's physical condition and limitations, wearing sneakers and a light jacket, it shouldn't have been possible, yet somehow he made it. For the families of the Yuba County Five, the lack of answers compounded their grief. Jack Madruga's mother said in a 1979 interview, "I could accept that my son got lost and died. That's horrible, but I could understand it. What I can't understand is why they were up there in the first place. Jack knew his car. He knew those mountain roads were dangerous. He would never have driven up there deliberately." Ted Weir's mother struggled most with the trailer discovery. They tell me Ted starved to death with food sitting next to him. They tell me he froze with a heater he could have used. That wasn't my son. Ted wasn't stupid. He could operate simple things. Why didn't he turn on the heat? Why didn't he eat? What was he thinking in those final weeks? Gary Mathias's family held on to hope for years that he might have survived and walked out, perhaps suffering memory loss or experiencing a continued psychotic episode. But as years turned to decades with no sign of him, that hope faded. Not knowing is the worst part, his sister said in a 2008 interview. We couldn't even have a funeral. We couldn't say goodbye. He's just gone. In recent years, the case has been re-examined by researchers, podcasters, and investigators using modern analytical techniques. None have provided satisfactory answers, though new theories continue to emerge. Some researchers point to a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, a hypothermia symptom where victims remove clothing because nerve damage makes them feel burning hot despite freezing to death. But this doesn't explain Ted Wyer's behavior, as he was inside a shelter and survived for weeks. Others suggest a psychological explanation that the men experienced collective panic or shared delusion, possibly triggered by witnessing something traumatic, which caused irrational decision-making. But this doesn't account for the physical impossibilities, particularly the distances traveled and the car's location. Environmental factors have been proposed: carbon monoxide from the car causing impaired judgment, or exposure to some unknown substance that created disorientation and memory loss. But tests on the car revealed no carbon monoxide issues, and no environmental hazards were identified in the area. The case has been compared to missing 411 phenomena, unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas that share similar bizarre characteristics. But this comparison raises more questions than answers, as missing 411 cases themselves lack definitive explanations. More than 4 decades later, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Why did they leave the direct route home and drive up a mountain road? What made them appear frightened to witnesses? How did they get the Mercury Montego so far up an impassable road? Why did they abandon a functional vehicle with plenty of gas? How did Ted Weir travel 19 miles through snow-covered wilderness and survive for weeks in a trailer? Why didn't he use the heater? Why didn't he eat more of the available food? What happened to Gary Mathias? Each question spawns additional questions, creating a recursive mystery that defies closure. Skeptics argue that some combination of bad luck, poor decisions, and tragic circumstances explains the events, that seeking more complex explanations is simply our discomfort with accepting how random and cruel nature can be. But investigators who worked the case, families who knew the men, and researchers who've studied the evidence continue to insist that something more happened, something that doesn't fit comfortable, rational categories. What we're left with is a case that challenges every expectation about how reality should function. 5 men left a basketball game and vanished into wilderness that should have killed them within hours. 4 were found months later, dead from exposure in patterns that made tragic sense, except that one of them survived for weeks or months with access to resources he inexplicably refused to use. The 5th man vanished completely, leaving no trace. Those who believe something beyond simple tragedy occurred point to the accumulation of impossibilities: the car's location, the distances traveled, Ted's survival and bizarre behavior, Gary's disappearance, the witness accounts of fear and strange lights. They argue that when enough impossible things happen in sequence, perhaps our understanding of possible is incomplete. Skeptics counter that every element, viewed individually, has potential rational explanation. Coincidence, poor decisions, environmental factors, and the human tendency to seek patterns where none exist can account for the strange details. The fact that we don't have complete answers doesn't mean supernatural or paranormal explanations are necessary. Yet the case resists comfortable categorization. It exists in that uncomfortable space where evidence and logic collide without resolution, where facts are clear but meaning remains opaque, where questions multiply faster than answers. Somewhere in the Sierra Nevada wilderness, the mountains keep their secrets. The forests where the Yuba County Five walked into the unknown continue to stand, indifferent to human desire for explanation and closure. The trailer where Ted Weiher spent his final weeks has long since been removed, but the questions it raised remain. Whether the answer involves human error compounded by tragic circumstance, or something stranger that our current understanding cannot accommodate, depends on how much uncertainty you can tolerate, how much you trust that reality always follows rules we comprehend, how comfortable you are leaving questions unanswered. For the families of Jack Madruga, Jack Hewitt, William Sterling, Ted Weiher, and Gary Mathias, there is no comfort in theories and speculation. There is only the absence of 5 men who went to a basketball game on a February night in 1978 and never came home. The question isn't what we believe happened. The question is whether we can accept that sometimes the truth disappears into the wilderness alongside the victims, never to be recovered.
We made it out of this one, but the darkness runs deep. If you think you can handle it, check out the other cases on the channel. Don't risk losing the signal. Like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. The next investigation is starting now.